I'm delighted to share with you this afternoon some results from recent research, public opinion research conducted by Baselice Associates on behalf of the Texas campaign to gauge voter views on sexual health education in public schools in Texas. Just a few technical notes before we get started. We are recording the session for folks who were unable to participate at this particular day and time, and it's going to be posted on our website in the coming days. We're also planning to share the slide deck in PDF version, so don't worry about feverishly writing your notes. We're going to share the slides in PDF following the presentation, as well as a one-page summary of the poll results that all of the registered webinar participants will receive. Currently, all participants are muted to minimize background noise, but if you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We are planning to do the full presentation and then reply to questions at the end, and then we'll follow up in writing with any questions that we are not able to get to during our time today. Also, it bears mentioning that due to COVID-19, we know that Zoom has been experiencing some heavy use and occasionally technical difficulties. The issues are usually brief, but we ask your patience and that you'd bear with us if we do have any technical challenges as we go through the presentation today. So next slide, please. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy is a nonpartisan, statewide 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 2009 with the mission of reducing teen pregnancy across the state of Texas. And we work to do that in 4 key strategies. One is in research and data. And so if you've had a chance to check out our websites, the link is at the bottom of your screen, www.txcampaign.org. We have a trove of information and interactive data charts and different materials, county level fact sheets, all kinds of information about teen births in Texas, some of which we have by county, as well as prevention strategies that are effective across the globe and here in the US, as well as here in Texas. And the presentation that we have today is part of our research and data strategy, as well as connected to our advocacy strategy. So we advocate for public policies that are designed to increase young Texans' access to information and healthcare to prevent unintended pregnancy. We also work in strategic collaboration with our partners across the state. And I want to give a special shout out to our partners at Healthy Futures of Texas and Interrupt in Dallas, who have been critical partners in the advocacy that we're currently engaged in, that this research is part of. And then also we conduct training and events for adult stakeholders whose decisions and attitudes and work all impact the lives and behaviors of young Texans. And so we offer trainings throughout the year. Our signature event is our annual symposium, which as a result of COVID-19 was re-envisioned this year as a series of virtual webinars throughout the end of the year. We also have done some regional summits in different areas of the state that are designed with content tailored specific to each region of the state. As you all know, Texas is a very big and very diverse state, and we're proud to serve all of those communities and do our best to make sure we reach partners all across the state. And again, I'm glad that you all could be with us. So today, we're going to go through a few materials, a little bit of background about sex education in Texas and the current policy landscape of what the state statute says, what the requirements are. We're going to talk a little bit about the State Board of Education and the health TEKS, which are the minimum standards. It stands for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll spend a lot of time talking about the polling results on Texas voter views about sex ed in schools. We'll talk a little bit about the Texas campaign's policy priorities and then talk about next steps in the process. So I want to talk a little bit about why now, why this is such an important opportunity and why we're paying attention to the health curriculum standards as they are under revision by the State Board of Ed, which we also refer to as SBOE. So this is the first revision of the health education standards in 22 years. So it's a very rare opportunity and can represent, advances that we've seen in sexual health science since 22 years ago, And we also know in terms of size and scope that approximately 1 in every 10 American students lives here in Texas. So in terms of market size and impact, what happens in Texas has an impact on our country. So again, it's really important that we get this right. Textbook publishers use standards that are developed in Texas to design their content. That's how big our market is. And with this opportunity, we really have a chance to ensure that every Texas student from every walk of life has access to the information that they need in every stage of life about healthy relationships of all kinds, not just sexual ones, and how to avoid unintended pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. We know that 63% of students become sexually active by their senior year of high school, and that virtually all will become sexually active at some point in their lives. And so we're working to ensure that they're prepared when they decide to make that decision. So our focus, as indicated by our name and mission, is on reducing unintended pregnancy, especially among populations that experience disproportionately high teen birth rates in Texas. And those include Hispanic and Black teens, teens who live in rural areas, teens who live in poverty, those who've experienced trauma or have been in the child welfare system, and young people who identify as LGBTQ. So you'll see some of our recommendations also overlap with other areas in similar fields and provide an opportunity to help protect children from sexual abuse, to prevent dating violence, and then ultimately over the long term to prevent workplace harassment once they enter the workforce. So what we have here really is an opportunity to ensure that all Texas K-12 students can access medically accurate information about their bodies and make informed decisions about their health and their futures. So next, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jen Biondo. She's our Director of Policy and Data at the Texas Campaign, and it is her beautiful charts and graphs that you see in her data analysis that really helps us make informed decisions as an organization. She's going to share a little bit about the landscape of sex ed policy in Texas. Jen?
Thank you so much, Molly. All right, so now we'd like to provide a little bit of background on some of the laws that govern sex education in Texas. So health class was removed as a graduation requirement by the Texas legislature in 2009. Health class is taught at the elementary and the middle school level, but there is minimal sex education content actually required in those grade levels. So as a result, research shows that 25% of Texas school districts don't teach any sex education at all. 58% report teaching abstinence-only curricula, and 17% teach what we refer to as abstinence plus curricula. However, the big school districts are more likely to be teaching abstinence plus curricula, so a larger percentage of total students are more likely to be receiving this type of content. So Chapter 28 of the Texas Education Code is where most of our laws around sex education live. And Chapter 28 specifies that schools must present abstinence as the preferred choice of behavior for unmarried people of school age, and is the only way that's completely effective at preventing pregnancy and STIs. However, school districts also have the option of providing additional information on topics like condoms and contraception, so long as they use actual use rather than laboratory effectiveness rates. And so we refer to this additional information as abstinence plus education. So Chapter 28 also lays out the process for school districts to adopt sex education curriculum and notes that parents must be notified of what their child will be learning in sex ed class, and it gives parents the right to review instructional material and pull their child out of any portion of the class without penalty. So just by way of an example, I'm the parent of 2 boys in Texas public schools, and throughout the year, I receive notifications in print and through email about when their sex education classes will be, and notifying me that I have the right to opt them out of class. So next slide, please. All right, so like we mentioned in the prior slide, the state legislature sets graduation requirements and writes statute that governs sex education. The State Board of Education, which is the body that we'll be discussing today, is charged with setting the minimum curriculum standards for each course, and then also adopting the instructional materials, such as textbooks. They also have a number of other functions that relate to things like school finance, but those are the topics that relate to our role today. So Texas is a state that very much values local control, and school districts have a great deal of latitude in the curriculum they adopt, as long as it's within the guidelines of state statute and the minimum curriculum standards. So school districts establish school health advisory councils, and these are volunteer advisory groups made up of parents and community members and local experts. And these school advisory councils, or SHACs, make recommendations on a variety of health issues, which can be things like vending machine content or recess policy, and then also what sex education curriculum they recommend that the district adopt. Next slide, please. All right, so let's go into a little more detail on the State Board of Education. So the SBOE is an elected body of 15 members, which is currently 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Now, these members represent very, very large districts. They serve nearly 2 million constituents each. So by comparison, a Texas state representative serves just over 150,000 constituents. So Republicans have held a majority on this body for more than a decade. The members are ideologically diverse, ranging from conservatives to moderates to liberals, and they come from a variety of personal backgrounds. So as you may expect on an education body, there are quite a few educators and former school board members, and then there are also medical professionals, ranchers, etc. And the chair of the SBOE is appointed by the governor, and the chair is Kevin Ellis, who is in the middle row on the second from the right. All right. So next slide. Oh, great. So the TEKS are standards that guide the curriculum that's taught for all courses from kindergarten to 12th grade in Texas public schools. These are the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, or TEKS. They take the form of statements that describe the minimum that students must learn within each course that's taught in Texas public schools. And again, this is the minimum requirements. So school districts can go above and beyond the minimum, but this represents the floor. And they're periodically revised for each class. So as Molly noted, the SBOE is now entering the process of reviewing the health education TEKS for the first time since the 1990s, specifically since Titanic was in the theaters. So the health education TEKS cover a wide variety of very important topics, which include things like physical health, mental health, injury and violence prevention, and then also reproductive health or sex education. So the process, and we won't spend too much time on this, but just to provide a little bit of background on the process, the members of the SBOE will review proposed TEKS, make changes, adopt amendments, and then ultimately adopt a set of TEKS that will guide the curriculum and classroom instruction. So regarding the review process, a series of work groups will each perform aspects of the review and then pass their work on to the next group. And then meanwhile, a standing group of content advisors will review these proposed drafts and provide comments. So we're nearing the end of this development process, and Work Group E's documents form the basis for the language that will be discussed, amended, and adopted over the next 5 months. So it is this Work Group E draft about which the SBOE will be hearing testimony at the June and July meetings. Next slide, please. Thank you for bearing with us through the deep policy wonk. It's good to understand the process. So as we engage in this review process, we're really looking to what the data support for effective sexual health education. And we have a wide body of research that supports evidence-based abstinence plus sex education, both for reducing the risk of outcomes like teen pregnancy and STIs, and also being supportive of healthy relationships that we know that youth are likely to enter, either while they're in school or shortly after they leave school in young adulthood. So research suggests that sex education does not make youth any more likely to become sexually active, but abstinence-only sex education can leave youth unprepared if they do enter into relationships, and often it isn't effective at delaying sex. And meanwhile, many health organizations point out that people have a right to factual information about their bodies and about how they can achieve health. And as many parents know, if youth are not provided information through reputable channels, it's likely that they'll seek out that information online, and it can be a toss-up whether or not they'll arrive at a reputable or an appropriate source for that information. Next slide, please. All right, so let's quickly cover some of the data on adolescent health in Texas. So like the rest of the nation, the teen birth rate in Texas has declined by more than 50% in the last decade alone, which is a striking public health phenomenon. However, more than 25,000 babies were born to a teen mother in Texas in 2018, which is the 9th highest rate per capita in the nation. And 1 out of 5 of those births were repeat birth, which is the highest rate of repeat birth in the nation. So altogether, about 2.5% of Texas teens gave birth in 2018, which is 44% higher than the national average. Our rates of pregnancy are also higher than the national average. And to put it another way, a baby is born to a teen mother once every 21 minutes in Texas. So even though teen births have declined, counts and rates of common STIs such as chlamydia and gonorrhea have increased significantly in the last decade. So counts have increased by about 25% in the last decade alone among youth. And while some of this increase can be attributed to better screening and detection and early treatment, the actual incidence does also appear to be on the rise. So unfortunately, we know that these risks are not evenly distributed across populations. Like so many other areas of public health, we see inequities that are disproportionately borne by people of color. And then we know that rates are also higher, as Molly noted, among youth in rural communities, youth in communities facing poverty, youth with a trauma history. So we really do see inequitable distribution of these factors. Next slide, please. All right, so the reason why you're here, the polling. So all of these factors led us to seek out public opinion polling. We wanted to find out how Texans feel about sex education in schools and what they believe that we should be teaching in schools. So we have many, many polls going back a number of years about sex education nationwide, and they find strong and bipartisan support for sex education very consistently. But it's been quite a while since we had such a poll conducted specifically about Texas beliefs. So we want to acknowledge that dialogue around sex education can be contentious. And we are very respectful of the fact that there are a variety of beliefs that are held about sex education. Many of these beliefs are deeply and strongly and very genuinely held on either side. So we acknowledge and we respect that. But our poll results show that while, of course, not everybody is in complete agreement, there is a deep and a bipartisan well of support for sex education in Texas. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit about the methodology. But before we talk about the methodology, I would like to talk about our wonderful pollster. We were hoping that he would be able to join us today, but he is in transit, and he just let us know that he is not able to make it on the webinar, unfortunately. But we wish he could be here with us because it has been such a privilege and an honor to work with somebody who's so experienced. So we were just thrilled to be able to work on this poll with Mike Baselice of Baselice Associates, which is really one of the most well-respected polling firms in Texas. So Mr. Baselice and his firm are based here in Austin, Texas, but they work nationally across a variety of issues. And they're primarily known for their work on Republican campaigns and conservative issues. So Mr. Baselice has such a deep well of experience. He's conducted more than 2,800 quantitative and qualitative research projects over the last 28 years, long established, highly experienced public research firm. And as a data nerd myself, I just so enjoyed working with them. So next slide, please. All right, so a little bit about polling methodology. So we conducted this poll in early March of 2020, just before the world shut down due to COVID-19. So Baselice and Associates contacted just over 600 registered Texas voters. It was a mix of over the phone and online. So this poll surveyed a representative sample of registered voters. And the polling area was divided into 6 regions and also sampled by gender. And it resulted in a margin of error of plus or minus 4%. Next slide, please. All right, and now we can dive into the polling results. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we want to stress is that we found a belief that sex education in schools supports parents. It does not undermine parents, it supports them in providing education for their youth. So survey respondents disagreed with the statement that students don't need sex education in schools since their parents can teach them what they need to know. 67% of respondents disagreed, and I found it interesting that grandparents disagreed with the statement at a higher rate than parents, and 63% of Republicans also disagreed. Next slide, please. So across this poll, what we found is that results show strong support for medically accurate abstinence plus sex education, and these results were consistent across every single political affiliation, age, ethnicity, gender, church-going behavior, every demographic factor that we looked at, we saw very, very strong support. So next slide, please. So one question was, what type of sex education should be taught in Texas public schools? And so our definitions were abstinence-only sex education, which teaches students that they should not engage in sex, or abstinence plus sex education, which teaches students that abstinence is the safest choice, but also provides medically accurate information about topics such as contraception, prevention of STIs, and healthy relationships. And then there's also an option that schools should not teach such education at all. And then there was an unsure option. And so what we found is that 75% of registered Texas voters support abstinence plus sex education. This includes 68% of Republican voters. So this is a very strong and very bipartisan result. About only 9% of voters supported abstinence-only education, including just 13% of Republicans. 9% said schools shouldn't teach sex education at all, including 14% of Republicans. Next slide, please. And so this question kind of reiterated the prior question about what schools should be teaching. So we asked whether or not respondents agreed that sex education in public schools should teach students about condoms and contraception along with abstinence. We saw even higher support for this statement. 79% of respondents agreed, including 72% of Republicans, 77% of rural voters, 79% of parents and grandparents. So again, very strong, very bipartisan support for education about condoms and contraception. Next slide, please. So we found majority support and typically at least 2/3 support, if not 3/4 support, for abstinence plus sex education in every subpopulation of respondents, including the groups that we would expect to be the most conservative. So for example, as we said, 68% of Republicans support abstinence plus sex education, and then 72% say that schools should teach about condoms and contraception. We also found that older Republicans, rural Republicans, and Republicans who report attending church weekly all support abstinence plus sex education at a majority level. So I can say that we had very rich demographic data. We were able to divide this data into more than 130 subcategories, and we only found support below 2/3 in 7 out of 132 subcategories. So extremely, extremely strong support no matter how the data is sliced and diced. And that 59% was the lowest number that we saw for any subpopulation. Next slide, please. So again, all subgroups of Democrats support abstinence plus sex ed at a very high level. So 85% of Democrats overall support teaching abstinence plus sex education. 93% of rural Democrats. It was interesting that rural respondents actually had very high support, and that might be because rural youth have higher rates of teen pregnancy. Non-Anglo Democrats, so this is Black and Hispanic Democrats, supported sex education at that same 85% level. And Democrats who are weekly churchgoers also supported at almost a 4/5 level. Next slide, please. And then again, this is just doing a deep dive into some of the data populations. So again, we see that rural voters are actually slightly more supportive of abstinence plus. We see that Hispanic and African American voters are more supportive slightly than Anglo voters, but all three do support abstinence plus sex education at very high levels. We see that support for abstinence plus sex education is to some degree associated with education levels, but I find it interesting that 63% of voters without a college degree support abstinence plus sex education, which is one of the lower numbers. But then when we ask if they support teaching about condoms and contraception, that number jumps to 83%. And then parents of children under 18 and grandparents of children under 18 both support abstinence plus sex ed at a very high level. Next slide, please. All right. So Molly is going to talk a little bit more about the policy priorities behind these, but I will do an overview of the data that we found in the poll. So 88% of respondents, including 86% of Republicans, agree that it's critical to teach students about consent, including respecting the boundaries set by other people about their bodies. So our current TEKs talk about refusal, but we were asking voters if they think it's important to talk about consent and respecting the boundaries of others. And we saw an extraordinarily high level of support for this. And that Republican-Democrat split is virtually non-existent. This is within the margin of error. So we can say that this is truly a bipartisan issue right here. Next slide, please. So we also asked about teaching respect for all. So we asked voters if they agree with the statement that to help prevent bullying of LGBTQ youth, public schools should include standards around cultivating respect for all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or identity. Now, we acknowledge that this can be a hot button issue, but what we found in these poll results is that respect is a Texas value. So 75% of Texans, including 65% of Republicans, agreed with that statement, and more than half agreed strongly. Next slide, please. All right, so those are the top line poll results. You can find more information on our Texas is Ready website, which we'll link later. And now I'm going to pass it back to Molly to talk about our policy recommendations.
Thank you, Jen. And I know that that was a lot of numbers and charts and graphs. And so if you have questions, I'd encourage you to drop those in the Q&A, and I will pass them to Jen for questions about methodology and the responses and so forth. But I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the policy recommendations that we have here at the Texas campaign. And I do want to reiterate a comment that Jen made earlier, that we acknowledge that these are tremendously sensitive issues. And a lot of Texans have deeply held beliefs on all sides of this issue from a lot of different perspectives. And so at the Texas Campaign, we're a data-driven organization, and we rely on data both in evidence-based approaches, as well as you can see, what resonates with the Texas population, because we do know that we have a unique demographic and geographic community here in Texas. So that said, a lot of what I'm about to share is actually addressed in the most recent draft version of the TEACS that was worked on by what's known as Work Group E, that the State Board of Ed will be reviewing and hearing testimony on at an upcoming meeting starting June 29th. So a lot of what we'll cover in these recommendations is included, and we were generally supportive with a couple of areas that we saw could be improved. So I'm going to go through basically what we're interested in seeing. Generally, the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy wants to see sexual health information presented to students that is age appropriate, medically accurate, and provides information about the basics of the human reproductive system and the process of physical, emotional, and mental maturity. Things like puberty, reproduction, biology, and menstruation. And this information is every bit as essential as the information about other health systems in the body, say like the circulatory system or the digestive system. And failure to teach about it in school can lead to misinformation and unnecessary or harmful stigma about basic bodily functions. So we want to make sure that those topics are covered. We take an abstinence plus approach, and Texas voters agree, as you've seen, that schools should include information about abstinence as well as the risks and benefits of other forms of contraception and STI prevention. And we would advocate for this at the 8th grade level. As Jen mentioned, there's not currently a requirement for a health credit at the high school level. And so inclusion of this information at the 8th grade level will make sure that every Texas student has access to this information to stay safe and healthy. We really want to make sure that information about contraception, especially, is presented in an accurate and a tone neutral way that presents both the risks and the benefits of all forms of contraception, including the long-acting reversible contraception, which is 99% effective in avoiding an unintended pregnancy and is specifically recommended for adolescent populations among medical experts such as the American Academy of Pediatricians. We'd also like to see information included on STIs, and that information should include prevention, screening, and treatment. Information about condoms for STI prevention should go along with more effective types of birth control and contraception. So we're looking for a dual approach, including a barrier method there. Next slide, please. So as you saw, the polling results really show strong bipartisan support for teaching about consent, including respecting the boundaries of others. So there is a lot of, I think, confusion about this term about consent, and we're seeing folks come to this issue with different perspectives. What we're advocating for is an age-appropriate approach. So at the youngest levels, so I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and when we're playing a tickle game and they say stop, we stop. For a kindergartner, they could choose whether they want a hug or a fist bump when they enter the classroom, or whether they just don't feel like being touched that day. And all of those things need to be taught as appropriate. When they get to older ages, it can be communicating how often you want someone to Snapchat you. And then preparing ultimately for conversation later in life when maybe one partner is ready for intimacy but another is not. And it's really important that both partners in that scenario take responsibility for setting boundaries, communicating those boundaries, and respecting the boundaries of the other person. And so, as Jen mentioned, the current TEAGs focus on the refusal component of that, but we believe that a more robust approach would be appropriate, especially around respecting boundaries of others, which the poll results show the strongest consensus around. The draft TEAGs currently includes strong language on this topic. We really support the inclusion of that language. We saw some feedback from the content advisors, which is the group of experts that have been appointed to help guide the State Board of Ed in their process. And I think that's likely due to interpretation about the word consent as meaning permission. But really, it's in the context of sexual assault, sexual abuse, and harassment prevention means so much more than that. And so we really want to demonstrate a holistic concept that sets expectations for everyone to respect boundaries. It's also really important to include information about the effect of alcohol and other substances on the ability to give consent, withhold consent, or perceive consent accurately. And all of those things are critical to include. Next slide. So as Jen mentioned, we know that inclusivity of youth who identify as LGBTQ can be a divisive issue in Texas. The current TEAGs, the current health TEAGs, nor the Workgroup E draft include any reference to LGBTQ youth, which is unfortunate because these young people are experiencing disproportionately higher rates of teen pregnancy than youth who identify as heterosexual or cisgender. This may be due to both higher risk factors as well as fewer protective factors. And these young people also are experiencing significantly higher instances of bullying and discrimination, which data tell us can lead to some serious mental health outcomes. We know that suicide is the third leading cause of death among youth ages 15 to 24. And LGBT youth are more likely to attempt suicide than their peers. It doesn't mean that the LGBT identity itself is the cause of the challenges, but the higher rates may be due to bias, discrimination, family rejection, and other stresses that are associated with how they're treated. So by teaching this information in an inclusive way could offer a protective factor. We also know that each episode of victimization, such as verbal or physical abuse, increases the likelihood of self-harming behavior by 2.5 times on average. Poll results tell us that respect is a Texas value, and so we would advocate for standards that teach respect for all, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, in order to protect youth who identify as LGBTQ in Texas. Next slide, please. So we've shared a little bit about some of the research that we've done. We've talked a little bit about the standards that we're hoping to see. I see some familiar names on our participant list. I know some of you are working to engage members, your representatives across the state. We do have some tools and resources available to support you if that is where you are. We have, as Jen mentioned, a website, texasisready.org, that has an advocacy toolkit. You can find out who your representative is on the State Board of Education. You can sign up to submit testimony during the next State Board of Education meeting, which is coming up. They'll be hearing testimony on June 29th. And I believe the registration opens I want to say the Thursday before on TEA's website. And then if you're also interested in helping us get the word out, you can share our materials on social media and e-news, what have you. I also want to answer a couple of questions that we have before we close. Let's see. Lisa Plattner Good to have you with us. Lisa asks, are there any plans to study the effects of COVID-19 on the teen birth rate? In parentheses, kids at home supposed to be in online schools. Lisa, I am not aware of any studies in the works on that, but we will definitely keep an eye out and share anything with you that comes across our desk in terms of ongoing research about the effects of COVID-19 on the teen birth rate. Thank you for your question. Next slide, please. So in terms of process, where we're in the process, as I've mentioned, we've got an upcoming public hearing of the State Board of Ed that's going to hear testimony, and then the members will discuss the current draft of the health education TEKS that Work Group E has worked on. Then in September, they'll have what's called first reading of the proposed TEKS and hear more testimony. At that point, they'll debate any amendments on the draft TEKS before they do a second reading and final vote in November, the week right before Thanksgiving. So this process will be wrapped up before the end of the year, but then the TEKS as they're adopted won't take place immediately. There'll be a little bit of lag time before they're actually implemented. So any additional questions that folks have, please do include those in the Q&A section. And we will be, let's see, what if the school your child is attending did not offer anything in elementary school? So this question comes from Beverly Mata Herrera. And Beverly, I think that comes down to local decision making. So local school districts can make determinations on what to teach and when. And so that would be a local decision is what we would have to say there. So if you're interested in getting involved in what's taught in your local schools, you can definitely find out how to get involved with what's called the School Health Advisory Council or Committee Council, Ginseng Council. So it's known as the SHAC, and sign up as a volunteer to find out more and get involved and help advise the district on how to proceed with those information.
And then we also have a couple of questions that are coming through the chat box rather than the Q&A box.
Okay.
Are you able to?
Sorry, I'm scooting over. Jen, if you can see them faster, you're welcome to take them.
Sure. Let's see. So the first one was from Anthony. Is there support for people who want to submit testimony but aren't sure how? So we have our Texas is Ready advocacy toolkit, which has a lot of information on how to engage with your SBOA member, including testimony. And you're also more than welcome to reach out to us. We can walk you through the process of submitting testimony and where all the links are and what that will look like. At the June meeting, it will be a virtual meeting. We'll be submitting virtual testimony in real time. So it'll be a new process. And then, are you able to see the additional chat question, Molly? Did you want that one or me?
Yeah, so there's a question about recommendations for introducing the existence. What are y'all's recommendations for introducing the existence of intersex people? How do y'all recommend students learn about biology, reproduction, and menstruation in ways that are not upholding the social construction of the gender binary? Would y'all be recommending students learn about the medical community's non-consensual medical experiments on communities of color when teaching about LARC and STIs? So I'll answer from my perspective, and then Jen, feel free to jump in if you know of anything. So I have not seen any research on education around introduction of education about intersex people. If you have that data about education, that would be helpful to have. In terms of introduction of biology, reproduction, and menstruation, what we've seen is references to people with uteruses using, specific biological terms for that particular situation of avoiding the gender binary. Recommending students learn about the medical community's non-consensual medical experiments on communities of color when teaching about LARC and STIs. This is another one that I haven't seen any data about teaching this particular topic, but I will say that our approach to access to contraception in terms of our policy and program priorities is all forms, all women, all the time, so that we know that the decision whether to use contraception and what type to use is very personal, and we're advocating that information be presented in a very factual way with human use rates specific to this population. So when we're talking about LARC, we're saying it can be 99% effective, and also talking about the risks and benefits of all of the other forms. So that would be my answer for that one. Jen, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, and thank you, Heather, for bringing that point up. We know that in our country we have a very ugly history of non-consensual actions around women of color and their reproductive health. The history of birth control and the history of STI research is very racist. We committed a lot of wrongs to women of color. So it is important to acknowledge that whether or not we would be able to get that specific information into the TEKS, which are the minimum curriculum standards, might be difficult. But it is, I think, always important to remember that birth control can be pushed on people in a way that is coercive. And it's critically important to avoid any type of reproductive coercion. We also know that one of the big barriers to reproductive access can be lack of information, lack of funding. So withholding access to somebody's preferred method of contraception, we think is also harmful. It's a fine balance, and it's something that we as reproductive health advocates really need to always have on our mind. So thank you for that, and thank you for that resource on intersex, folks. We will definitely take a look at that and see what we can incorporate. So just as a point of reference for people on the webinar, we know that somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.7% of people have some sort of intersex traits, whether or not they're visible or not. That's about as common as being a redhead. So definitely valuable information for a large number of folks. And then we had one more question through the Q&A box. Do charter schools have shacks? I believe they've, I would actually need to check on that. I think Ellen, who is on the webinar, might know that off the top of your head. Ellen, if you want to provide that information, feel free, but otherwise we'll need to get back to you on the specific way that charter schools implement sex education.
That was my answer, Jen. I'm not sure, but I'll check. Any other questions or comments? If anyone has any final thoughts, be sure to include those. We want to thank everybody for your time today. We are going to be following up again with a PDF of the slides that you've seen, as well as a one-pager that you can use. It's just a summary of the poll results as we go.
Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you being here with us today, and feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Have a good afternoon,
everyone. Take care.